Welcome to the Defence Connect podcast, Australia's leading voice in national security and defence industry intelligence, direct from the nation's top policy and business experts.
Well, g'day everybody, Steve Kuper here at Defence Connect. I hope you're well, and if like me, you are no doubt watching and monitoring the situation in the Middle East almost by the hour, as it has wide-reaching ramifications on Australia's way of life, as well as our national security, not just in terms of defence, as we've seen President Trump put out a call to arms for nations, both friendly and what some would consider a foe, to provide support and naval assistance in the Straits of Hormuz. But it's an interesting time for Australian defence policy, defence industry, for our national security conversation as a whole. And with that in mind, I decided it would be a good idea to get the new opposition shadow defence spokesman. He's one of the rising stars of the Liberal Party. And for those of you who were paying attention to the 2025 election campaign, he was certainly the face and the voice of the coalition during that campaign. And joining me virtually is Senator James Paterson, the Senator for Victoria and Shadow Defence Minister for the opposition. Senator, how are you today?
Great, Steve. Thank you very much for having me, mate.
Not a problem. Happy to have a chat. And this isn't your first time on our
No.
podcast, so you know the ropes pretty well. But for people who aren't familiar with your career trajectory and your career in Parliament, just give us a cliff notes for who you are, what you do, and where you're going.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve. I was first elected to represent Victoria in the Senate in March 2016. I filled a casual vacancy in the Senate then and was re-elected at the double dissolution election in 2016. And for most of my parliamentary career, I've been focused on economics and national security, but particularly for the last 5 years or so, I've been heavily focused on national security. In 2021, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, asked me to chair the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, where I was very involved in big debates about Australia's relationship with China in particular. And in opposition, Peter Dutton asked me to be the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs and Cybersecurity. So obviously very focused on domestic national security issues, all of which have a pretty strong international component. And the cybersecurity portfolio in particular has a lot of overlap with the defence portfolio. Following the leadership change from Susan Leader, Angus Taylor, Angus has asked me to replace him as the Shadow Minister for Defence. I've had a long interest in defence issues and I was delighted to be offered that portfolio because, in my view, there are few portfolios which are more consequential to the future of our country than defence. I mean, the decisions that we make in this space literally determine whether or not we will be a sovereign liberal democracy in the future and whether we'll be able to hand one over to our future generations, my kids, and hopefully one day my grandkids included. So it's a very motivating area of public policy to work on. And frankly, I think it needs a lot of attention.
Mm. And we know that the government's been, I don't want to say testy, but touchy is probably the right framing for it, around the American-led operation in the Middle East and the ramifications. We've seen the Minister for Energy and Climate Change repeatedly try to calm the horses around the fuel security implications and what that means for Australia. But in terms of like the hard-nosed defence policy, the procurement side of things, the force structure, what are the immediate priorities that you've identified since coming into the position, noting your experience through PJCIS and your long-standing interest in defence?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a couple of macro issues, big picture issues that are just critical to get right. If you don't get right, nothing else follows. And then there's lots of smaller issues that are incredibly important. The macro issue, which I think is most important, is the level of defence spending. I think when you've got Sir Angus Houston and Professor Peter Dean, who completed the Defence Strategic Review for the Albanese government, they are the two best informed private citizens in Australia about the state of the Defence Force and its readiness. And they have both publicly said, since they completed that review, that Australia is not spending enough on defence, that we need to be spending closer to 3%, and that if we don't lift defence spending to those levels, then AUKUS, which is a very important, very worthy project will effectively cannibalize our other defense services because it is like a fourth service. It's so
Mm,
large in its scale and its spending that peacetime standard 2% of GDP spending levels is inevitably going to lead to cannibalization. And we've seen that. I mean, we've seen so much capability cancelled over the last 4 years under this government. Army has borne a particularly heavy brunt of that cancellation of procurement. And I'm really worried about the flow on consequences that has for morale and ultimately retention and recruitment, which are other critical issues which we need to solve.
mm. We saw even overnight people like Michael Shoebridge from Strategic Analysis Australia and Jen Parker, who long-time listeners of the podcast will know quite well. I'm just looking at the article now. We're saying that in essence, Navy is not in a state to contribute anything to the Middle East should we be asked. And at least for the time being, we seem to have dodged any any direct request from the Americans to provide support. But should other nations, and I know the French have also indicated that they would be less likely to provide support and military assets on the ground or in the area, we're really at risk of damaging our long-standing security relationships, not just with the United States, but with the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, really consequential nations that all have a vested interest in Australia being a robust, capable and independently capable partner.
Mm.
What what would you like to see the government do straight away?
It is very worrying when you've got commentators who are well informed, like Jennifer and Michael, and they're in good company on this issue, say that they believe that the Australian Navy, if called upon, couldn't usefully contribute to an exercise like this. And unfortunately, I think their fears are well founded, given that 2 years ago, in 2023, when the Houthi terrorist organization was holding the Red Sea to ransom, or the world to ransom through the Red Sea, we know the Biden administration did ask Australia to make a contribution to that, and we said no. And at the time and since, there's been a lot of public speculation that the reason why we had to say no is that so few of our surface combatants were appropriately equipped to defend themselves from incoming drone and rocket fire. Particularly the Anzac class frigates, we were told by experts, couldn't have adequately defended themselves in that scenario, and it would have been too risky to deploy them. And the air warfare destroyers, which are better equipped for that kind of mission, are too few and often not in the water to be able to be deployed responsibly to a mission like that.
Hmm.
So I fear if a request does come in the Strait of Hormuz from the United States, that we will again, whether we want to provide a commitment or whether we don't, that we simply won't be in a position to, because as far as I know, very little has happened in those 2 years to upgrade the Anzac class, for example, to make them better able to protect themselves in an environment like that. And if they can't be deployed to that environment, what environment could they be safely deployed to anywhere in our national interest?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and the point you made around too few Hobart class is very well made. And unfortunately, successive governments have refused to kind of continue building Hobart class.
Mm,
They're very formidable ships, and now that they're undergoing their Aegis
mm.
upgrade to baseline 9, will only be more formidable. Um, but
But
in
out of the water, unfortunately. A
yeah,
very capable platform, but if it's not available when it's needed, then we have a problem.
yes, yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, replacing 9 ships with 3 hulls is just the mathematics doesn't work, unfortunately. And
Mm,
it's very concerning. And it comes back to the question around defense spending. And we saw mid to late last year, both the president and vice president were very keen to crack 5% of defense spending for NATO members, but it wasn't just 5% on traditional military
mm,
capabilities. It was 3.5 on what you and I would consider hard military capabilities, your ships, your aircraft, your combat troops, and things like that, and 1.5% on enabling military capabilities like infrastructure and cybersecurity and things like that.
mm.
We've seen a lot of our debate here seem to frame around 2.5 to
Mm.
3%.
Yeah.
With that in mind, how do you see the debate moving forward, conscious of what's happening in in the Middle East, what's
Mhm.
happening in Ukraine, and if reports are to be believed, what seems to be simmering around Taiwan
Mm.
because America's distracted.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, this is a sovereign choice for Australia, and we should set our own defence spending based on our own best understanding of what we need, and we should listen to our best informed experts. It's one thing for a US administration to tell us they think we need to increase defence spending, but when Sir Angus Houston and Professor Peter Dean say we need to increase defence spending, we should listen to them, particularly because they're in such good company. I'm not aware of a prominent national security expert in Australia who thinks we are spending enough. Almost universally, they all say we
Mm,
need to spend more. Now, where that ends up, let's wait and see. But it certainly, we took a policy to the last election that we should be aiming to get to 3% of GDP over time, and I think that's still, the strategic environment hasn't gotten any more safer since then. It's got worse, and I know a lot of people think, well, that's a lot of money, and that there's an opportunity cost for other worthy things, but the truth is, deterrence is much cheaper than having to fight a war, and that is the purpose of our defence budget. It is firstly to hopefully prevent conflict by being a credible deterrent along with our allies and friends. And obviously, if the worst comes to worst and we're not successful in deterring conflict, we're at least prepared for it and we're better likely to survive it and protect our interests.
mm.
But you only have to look at history and look at what Australia was spending during the Vietnam War, the Korean War, let alone World War II or World War One. You'd be spending much more than 3% of GDP if we find ourselves in an environment like that. And we're told time and time again, this is the most dangerous strategic environment since the end of World War II.
And with that in mind, part of the concern is that there's been a focus on developing what Professor Dean and Sir Angus Houston termed a focused force rather than a balanced force. In your opinion, do you think that's the right shift? Do we need to be a little bit more balanced, or are we at risk of becoming too submarine heavy, for
Mm,
example, that is going to present some challenges operating in the archipelagic waters and
mm.
littoral environments of Southeast Asia and things like that?
Yeah, so I've read the DSR, but I've not yet had a classified briefing on
Mm,
it, and I want to seek that both from the department and ultimately from Sir Angus and Professor Dean, because I know there are classified assessments that led them to make those recommendations, and I wouldn't want to speculate on it publicly without having the benefit of what they've understood. But sometimes I think that we have an unfortunate debate in Australia where people look at it, the number, particularly the $368 billion figure attributed to AUKUS submarines over its 30-year lifetime, and say, instead of doing that, we should be spending it on drones or missiles. And my very strong view is that this is not an either or proposition. We need both. We need platforms like that, which have a generational advantage over any potential adversary in our region. They are the
mm,
most capable stealth strike platform available in the world today. And the United States is willing to give them to us. That's an extraordinary achievement of Australia that they're willing to do that. So we absolutely must do that. And we also must have an investment in those asymmetric capabilities like drones and missiles, including, air warfare, integrated air defense for our northern approaches as well, so that we can make a larger adversary think twice. Some of those platforms, including Virginia class submarines, are actually quite critical to deploying some of those asymmetric capabilities, and you only can deploy them when you have those exquisite platforms.
mm. I was actually listening to an interview between Winston Marshall and Air Vice Marshal Edward Stringer this morning, and he's obviously in the UK context, and they're in the middle of having a very similar debate to what Australia is, and he was saying that in essence the British Armed Forces could not go and fight if it was called upon. They're barely able to send a single destroyer to defend Royal Air Force installations in Crete. It
Mm,
seems to be a bit of a challenge that's shaping the Western alliance outside of the United States. We know the
mm.
US has got its own structural issues in terms of industrial pull through and things like that. What more would you like to see us do in terms of leveraging our relationship with the United Kingdom, or leveraging our relationship with Japan and South Korea
Yeah.
and other nations that have the capacity to build at scale and do so quickly to bring us up to match fitness?
Yeah, my biggest concern is that it appears to me that we've failed to heed the lessons of Ukraine. And those same lessons are being taught to us again in Iran. We are in an age of missiles and drones. And if Ukraine, which effectively has no navy, can sink the entire Black Sea fleet of the Russian Navy by
Mm.
using cheap drones, then there are pretty profound lessons for Australia to learn. And if the Iran and particularly the IRGC can keep the Straits of Hormuz closed, again by using cheap drones and relatively cheap missiles against the full might of the US Navy, then there's a lesson to be learned there for Australia. And I just don't see that we've changed our kind of peacetime defence procurement culture in the
Mm.
department to adapt to the new world that we're in. And unless we do, I think we're going to wake up in a few years' time and really regret how we misused this opportunity to prepare.
And in terms of the performance of USVs and UUVs, Ukraine has obviously really maximized the efficacy and the, to use a bit of your language, asymmetric opportunities presented as a result of them to really decapitate the Black Sea fleet. But conversely, Iran's own quite formidable USV fleet, we're not quite sure what their UUV capability is like, but their submarines have been, in essence, completely wiped out. But their USVs have been essentially decapitated and aren't necessarily being the force multiplier that they were in the Ukrainian case. Is this again a bit more of that call for balance and detailed consideration of what our makeup looks like moving forward?
Well, there's no question that when you've got the United States and Israel working together against Iran, you've got a massive overmatch of conventional military capability. And that's been demonstrated in that the US has been able to drop with Israel so much ordnance on Iran with so little resistance from Iran. Although we should note that this is really the second wave of the attacks after the 12-day war last
Mm.
year that had an opportunity to weaken, particularly Iran's missile defense. But nonetheless, a regime which has been under assault by the world's most formidable military power, is still able to show signs of resistance and still able to exert real pain on the international economy and on oil markets in particular through relatively unsophisticated from a technological point of view interdiction of oil trade in the Straits of Hormuz.
Mm.
All they have to do is sink a carrier once a week to the bottom of the Persian Gulf, and no insurance company in the world will insure an oil tanker to go through it. And if they do that, they can block 20% of the world's oil supply and
Mm.
really, hold us all to ransom. So even a depleted, basically defeated regime in every other conventional military sense still has this asymmetric capability to hurt us, and we need to adjust to that as well.
Mm. Mm. And there's an angle to this that I'm not 100% sure of, and I would like to get your take on it, and it is the China angle. We know that 90% of Iran's oil flows via the Strait of Hormuz to Beijing and to its own oil refineries. They have the Chinese government has been very bolshy in terms of its public positioning, saying that they have got their strategic reserve or their equivalent of the strategic reserve completely full. They can ride this out. But surely, if to your point, the Iranians are sinking or at least severely disabling a crude oil carrier coming out of the Gulf. The Chinese government and the Chinese economy at some point is going to face some pretty um, heavy costs in
Mm,
terms of its access to liquid fuels.
mm,
At what point do you think we see some Chinese influence in the back saying, "Hey, okay, enough's enough. You need
mm.
to calm down. We need a conversation here." And do you think that's likely to be a direct conversation that they have with the United States, or is that going to be something that you think they have via a back channel with the Iranians to then have that conversation with the US?
Well, we do know that from open source reporting that China has invested very significantly in that storage of liquid fuels to bolster their liquid fuel security, because they've identified some time ago that as a key strategic vulnerability for them. But no storage solution is infinite. And at some point, if the flow of crude and refined fuels into China stops, or stops for long enough, then that will have an implication for them. They can't indefinitely support their economy. So
Yeah.
my assessment would be the same as yours, that at some point they'll be asking that that be addressed. There already has been some media reporting speculating that the Iranian regime may allow oil tankers through the strait as long as they are settled in yuan, as in Chinese currency, denominated vessels will be allowed to pass. I'm not sure how practical that is in the real world, but the fact that there's even speculation about that suggests that it is something that the Iranian regime is sensitive to. They know
Mm.
that they're a core supplier for Iran, and President Trump knows that too. There's a reason why he's threatening Karg Island, not just the military assets on the island, which he's already struck, but also the oil refining and fuel refining capacity on that island. If that is taken out, then although we'll all deal with higher oil prices, it's ultimately China that will hurt the most.
There has been, I'm sure you, like I, and many of our listeners are privy to a lot of the open source intelligence that goes around on platforms like X and Substack. There is concerns around what this looks like for the world, but also the United States in particular, given the fact that President Trump was quite prominent in campaigning on saying, hey, no more foreign wars, no more Middle East wars.
Mm,
I think a lot of people were very surprised at just how quickly and bloodless they managed to pull off the Venezuela strike.
mm,
Um, but we know now that the United States has spun up the 31st Mu out of Japan, and it's on its way to the Middle East. And there is at least some speculation that they may deploy the Mu to actually take Karg Island, which adds another layer of complexity. And this is a real insight into how America conducts integrated operations
mm,
across multiple domains of capability. But also, it will be a real proving point for littoral maneuver in a
mm, mm,
contested environment, which is something that the Australian Army is really, hammering in on. But
mm,
it's, to your point, Army's kind of been left in the lurch in terms of the funding. It's clear, delineated, and defined role outside of, yep, you're going to do long range strike and littoral maneuvers. Do you think we should be watching this a little more closely than what we are? And I know we've got National Defence Strategy and Integrated Investment
mm.
Program coming up soon. Would you like to see, how strongly would you like to see lessons learned from Iran be filtered through?
Look, I think it's critically important that we watch this closely. It's one of the reasons why the opposition was very supportive of the deployment of the E-7A Wedgetail
Mm,
to the conflict, because we think there are lessons for Australia to learn in terms of that anti-drone and anti-missile warfare. There is no substitute for real life experience. Training is incredibly important, but it is the real world that ultimately people are tested in. It's one of the reasons, by the way, I'm quite bullish on the strength and influence of the US military. It's the most battle tested military in the world and has experience in a range of multi domain operations, drone operations, in the way in which their potential adversaries in the future just have not had that real world experience in any meaningful timeline. So I'd love to see these lessons learned integrated into those upcoming reports, as you say. Also, of course, Ukraine, which, as I said before, hasn't been adequately, learned. But the real test as to whether the government has learned from the last couple of years is, of course, the budget and whether there's increased defence spending or not.
mm.
If there's not a meaningful uplift in defence spending, I think we can confidently say this is a government that talks a good game when it comes to national security and defence, but doesn't follow through and doesn't invest in it. And the truth is, we know that Richard Marles and Pat Conroy have gone to the Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet multiple times before multiple budgets and got knocked back and sent back to do more work and not given the increased funding that everybody knows the ADF needs.
In terms of that, and conscious that NDS and IIPR refreshes are at least a month or two away. I'm hearing April. I'm not sure what you're hearing. Um, part of the criticism of the original Defence Strategic Review was that it was very thin and very light on the actual strategy of what we were trying to affect. And part of the problem that we have in terms of trying to get capability into our into the hands of the warfighter and delivering the capability that they need, is that we have a budget driving a strategy, not a strategy driving a budget.
Mm.
Do you see some validity in that point of view?
There's no question that's exactly what is happening. And when you see something like JP9102, the military satellite communications cancellation, the F-35 4th Squadron, the infantry fighting vehicles, the self-propelled howitzers, infantry reserve days being brought down from 200 to 150, all of that is reminiscent of a budget setting the strategy, not a strategy setting the budget. Because if a strategy was setting the budget, I don't think you'd be making cuts like those. You're
Mm,
only making cuts like those to fund things like Henderson and Osborne and Sterling, all of which are critically important components of AUKUS, but all of which will deliver meaningful military capability in the medium or long term, not in the short term. And
mm.
we've got the DSR, which tells us that the warning time is gone, that conflict could break out at any moment, and we're cutting upfront capability that would have been received now and over the next few years to pay for medium and long term capabilities. So I think that's all the data you need to know that budget constraints are driving military strategy, not military strategy driving budget investments.
Mm. So with that in mind, top three priorities for you for the next 12 to 18 months in terms of what you would like to really hammer home and hopefully shift the government's view on.
Number one is addressing the funding shortfalls, and I will consider myself as having done a good job if Richard Marles and Pat Conroy get a big increase in defence spending in the budget. This is not one of those public policy areas where you want your opponents to fail. I want them to succeed for the sake of our country, and I hope they increase defence spending so that we don't have to wait for a future election and a change of government to do so.
Mm.
Secondly, I'm really concerned about the recruitment and retention crisis. The ADF is its people, no matter what capabilities and platforms you have, if you don't have the people to operate them, then you are in a really dire place. And everything they've tried so far over the last 4 years hasn't worked. And then thirdly, procurement reform. Now, the government is initiating this new defence delivery agency, and the rationale of that is to streamline and make efficient our procurement processes. I hope they're successful, but I
Mm.
am concerned that they've waited 4 years into government before launching a major machinery of government change, which we know just slows things down. It gums up the bureaucracy while people work out what their new jobs are and find
Yeah.
their new desk and get their new letterhead. This is not a time where we need any more delays than we already have in our procurement system. But if you fund the Defence Force right, if you get them the right people, and if you speed up procurement so that the time between acquisition and putting capability in the hands of a ward fighter is shortened, then I think we can meet the challenges that we face.
Interesting. I know you've got a hard out. I have one question, and I know you're an avid fan of the Trigonometry podcast, so I have borrowed this from them. What's the one thing in this area that we're not talking about that we should be?
Oh, that's a really great question. I mean, I think dropped off the radar in recent years has been just the extent and the breadth of the cyber threat that
Mm.
Australia faces. 5 years ago, it was mainstream to talk about that, and we had high-profile cyber events like Optus and Medibank and others, which brought it to the fore. But over the last couple of years, that has subsided as an issue. It is a real and ongoing threat, and I'm concerned that our critical infrastructure operators in Australia still aren't match fit, and that they've got a long way to go to invest in their own cyber defense to make sure that the first shot fired in cyberspace of a future conflict doesn't prevent us from getting into the fight and deploying our warfighters in the way we need to.
On that, do you think we need to be a little less concerned about stepping on toes in cyberspace?
Yeah, I think we should, speak much more clearly about our capabilities to telegraph them to our potential adversaries, and we
Mm.
should let our operators at the Australian Signals Directorate off the leash to use those capabilities, both on criminal elements, which we know have sought to do our country harm, but also adversaries. We know that Iran and the IRGC has taken an interest in our country in the past. They are clearly not a friendly nation. Maybe ASD is hard at work on that fight right now as part of the Five Eyes, and it just hasn't been publicised.
Mm.
But if it hasn't been publicised, I think it should be. And if they're not doing it, I think that should be part of it.
Mm. One thing that I have had a thought around, and the contentious social media legislation that went through is neither here nor there, but we know that in the Chinese context, platforms like TikTok are used to brainwash isn't the right word, but to influence their domestic youth in terms of driving interest in science and engineering and maths and academic performance and physical education and also driving interest in national history and patriotism and things like that. Given your experience from PJCIS and as Shadow Home Affairs Minister, do you think there's a role for the Australian government to be playing in that space where we turn the information warfare domain that has been weaponized against us and not just us, our partners in the United States and across the West writ large? Do you think there's an opportunity and there should be an avenue for us to turn that information warfare theatre on its head and really start to push back by emulating some of that with Australian characteristics?
Just because there's an information war doesn't mean there's going to be a real war, but every real war is preceded by an information war as countries try to mobilize their own citizens and divide and distract and shape the choices of their potential adversaries. And there is an information war going on right now, and there are people who are actively trying to use modern technology and social media platforms to divide and weaken our countries. And as a liberal democracy, we haven't done anywhere near enough to combat that, and we've allowed ourselves to become victim to that. I think we need to take it much more seriously, because if a real conflict does start in the next 5 or 10 years, I want to enter into that conflict with a population that is patriotic, that is motivated, that loves their country, that is willing to serve, not a country which is divided, which is been cut into smaller tribes and fighting against each other, which doesn't love their country, not proud of their institutions, and not proud of their history. And so I think we've got a lot of work to do, both to promote that patriotism and pride in country, and to educate Australians about our history and the good things about our country, and also not make it so easy for adversaries to use these technology platforms as weapons against us.
Senator, thank you very much for your time today. For people who want to stay up to date with the latest of from your point of view, where can they find more information?
I'm on every social media platform except WeChat and TikTok. So you can find me on X and Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. And you can also go to my website where you can sign up to my email list, senatorpaterson.com.au.
Excellent. And for people who want to stay up to date with the latest in defence industry and the national security conversation, head over to defenceconnect.com.au, or you can find us at all of your social media outlets bar TikTok. Until next time, bye-bye.